When it comes to the Nintendo Switch, Nintendo seems hellbent on not giving people one thing that they really want, and that is a standard, traditional virtual console service. We of course have seen the virtual console on the Wii, the 3DS, and of course the Nintendo Wii U. But for whatever reason, Nintendo doesn't want to do that. With their upcoming online service, you'll be able to access some NES games via online stuff and play these games online, but it doesn't seem like we're going to get a traditional virtual console service, which is a shame because I think the Nintendo Switch is the perfect system for that. So of course you have other companies stepping in to bring arcade and retro gaming experiences onto the Nintendo Switch. Hamster has been putting out a ton of different games on the Nintendo Switch, whether they're Neo Geo classics or of course some arcade games like the Super Mario or like Mario Brothers Arcade, Super Mario Brothers Versus, so on and so forth. And I love the Neo Geo. I think it's a great system. There's so many awesome fighting games on there, but it's not a system that I grew up with or a lot of people grew up with because it was expensive as hell. The Neo Geo was so freaking expensive. It's still expensive to collect for, and I was always more of a Sega man growing up. I love Sega. You guys know I love Sega. So I've had my eye on the SEGA Ages collection because it's something that I think will be really cool. And we finally have some more details about the SEGA Ages collection. So in this video, I wanted to talk about what's going on with the SEGA Ages collection, what sort of stuff is coming, and what sort of stuff I hope to see coming to the SEGA Ages collection on the Nintendo Switch. So sit back, relax, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about what's going on with SEGA Ages and the Nintendo Switch.
Hey, RGT 85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards!
In a recent interview with the Japanese Nintendo magazine Nintendo Dream, SEGA Ages lead producer and director Mr. Kodama and supervisor Mr. Akunari basically spoke about the SEGA Ages collection and what people can expect, and also teased some stuff. Now, a full translation of this interview is available over on NintendoEverything.com. I will have a link to it in the description box down below if you'd rather read over it than hear my voice talk about it and of course theorize about things. They translated this interview themselves, so it's worth checking out, of course, to get all the nitty-gritty details, but I basically just want to talk about the things that stuck out to me and then sort of hypothesize about something that we'll talk about towards the end of the video. So basically what's going on with SEGA Ages is, if you case are not familiar with it, they announced this as to be coming to the Nintendo Switch in the fall of 2018. Now, if you're not familiar with what SEGA Ages is, it's basically sort of a way to play old games with new features and things like that, old SEGA games that is. It was a very popular line actually in Japan on the PS2. They released tons of different versions of the SEGA Ages collection over in Japan, but I guess us gaijins over here in North America, we're not worthy of the SEGA Ages collection on the PS2. Now, there was a couple volumes that did come out stateside, but I mean, there was so many different volumes that released in Japan for the SEGA Ages collection on the PS2, and some of them were really cool. It's some of the best ways to play some of these classic SEGA games, and I was always really jealous of it. I still want to import some of them, but SEGA Ages is coming to the Nintendo Switch, and that's pretty exciting. It will be a worldwide thing, so no matter what region you're in, you can experience these games. Of course, if these games come out in Japan first, it doesn't really matter because the Nintendo Switch eShop is region free if you make an account for those regions. So I have an account for pretty much every region so I can access these games. Now, some of the things that stuck out to me in this interview was the fact that there's going to be Switch specific features, and they're not trying to compromise the integrity of these games, but it's basically stuff that gamers would expect to be in their games today. Game Ground, which is an arcade game that I'm actually not super familiar with, will actually be able to be played in vertical mode, which is really cool, so that way you can use the full Nintendo Switch screen, and I think that's a really nice addition. They also talked about how there's going to be online stuff, you know, in the Sega 3D Classics collection for the Nintendo 3DS, great collection of games, awesome stuff there, but there was no sort of online play. Now, they have confirmed that there will be online play in some of these games in the SEGA Ages collection, so that's really cool as well. I'm sure there'll be some online leaderboards and things like that. It'll be interesting to see if multiplayer games, though, have the ability to play online with people as well. We saw that in the Sega Genesis collection that just came out on the PS4 and the Xbox One. There was some online stuff if you wanted to play online with friends, so I hope that that feature transfers over. I think that would be a really smart thing to do, because that's one of the things that's sort of lacking, in my opinion, about the hamster releases of all these awesome Neo Geo fighting games. There's online leaderboards, but you can't fight people online, and it's like, I'd really like to fight people online in these games because they're so damn good. So that's a really important thing to me as well. But I think the biggest thing I took away from this interview is the thing we have to theorize about, because they're teasing lots of things when it comes to this. They're not really pulling back the veil on it. They're not showing their whole hand when it comes to what's coming in these versions of the Nintendo Switch games. Obviously, Sonic is one of the first games that's going to be on there. They've also talked about Thunder Force 4, which is supposedly the Saturn version of the game, which is very exciting. But in this interview, they said, we are planning to release 1 or 2 titles monthly. We initially revealed 5 titles with the announcement of SEGA Ages for Nintendo Switch, but we actually have more than 15 in the works. 15 different games? Okay, now you have my attention, Sega, because there's a lot of potential things that they could be doing with this. Obviously, like I just said, the Thunder Force 4 version of the game is going to be the Saturn version of the game, so that really starts to make me think, will we see Saturn stuff and Dreamcast stuff? It has been lightly teased. Obviously, stuff like Sega Genesis and old arcade games are much easier to do, but Game Ground is an arcade game as well, and I believe it's the arcade version of the game that's coming to the Nintendo Switch. So now I have to sit back and think, if there's 15 other games coming, games that you haven't talked about, what could those games possibly be? So I wanted to talk about very briefly just a few of the games that I would love to see in the SEGA Ages collection and why I think they would be a great fit for the SEGA Ages collection. First and foremost, I think Daytona USA needs to be here. This is a game that was released in arcades, and of course we got a Sega Saturn version. We actually got 2 Sega Saturn versions, then there was a Dreamcast version, then there was a version on Xbox Live and PS3 Arcade. But I think Daytona USA would be a perfect fit. Arcade racing games are still super fun, and this is a game that really defined Sega in the mid-90s. You know, you didn't go to an arcade without looking for Daytona USA. I'd be walking around the arcade and I'd hear Daytona, and I'd be like, where is it? Where is it? I need to play it. Like, that game was just so good, and it was so much fun, and it's really that pick up and play style that would really do well on the Nintendo Switch. I think having Daytona USA on the go would be absolutely awesome. Another game I'd really like to see is Virtua Fighter 2. I think Virtua Fighter 2 is, to me, the pinnacle of the series. It was a fantastic game, and also was an arcade game that released on the Sega Saturn as well. Both versions of the game are absolutely phenomenal. I will take either one gladly. The Saturn version, of course, had some extra stuff in it, but the arcade version of the game is great as well. It's a timeless fighting game, and a game that would really benefit from these additional features that they've been talking about, stuff like online play and things of that nature. I would love to play some Virtua Fighter 2 with other people online, so I think that game would be a really good fit when it came to the SEGA Ages collection. Now, of course, they're not going to release all of these big heavy hitters all at once. You know, probably stuff like Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter 2, it's something more down the road. So looking at Sega Genesis stuff, I think there's a lot of potential games that need to come to this platform as well with some modern features. Games like Phantasy Star 4. Phantasy Star 4 is a game that is pretty much forgotten about when it comes to the Phantasy Star series, just because of how PSO or pretty much came to be a thing. You know, Phantasy Star Online is mostly what people think about when they think of Phantasy Star. But Phantasy Star 4 was an awesome RPG game that really not enough people talk about, in my opinion. There's just so much stuff that they could potentially do with this, and that's what really makes this exciting. Are they going to look at more Genesis stuff? Are they going to look at more classic arcade games? Are they going to look at games like Alien Syndrome and things like that, which would be great to have online multiplayer with? Will they look at stuff like the Sega Saturn? I think that the Sega Saturn is going to be a pretty stealth announcement, but I think it's going to be something. They've teased it already. They've said in previous interviews that if these initial batches of games are successful, you could potentially see Sega Saturn stuff. You could potentially see Dreamcast stuff. I've actually done a video talking about all that stuff, so make sure you guys go check out that video. That was around the Sega Fan Fest or whatever that was a couple months ago, and they really showcased a lot of classic Sega stuff. I think Sega is finally starting to embrace their older stuff and really embrace their older IPs. There's so much awesome stuff. House of the Dead, Ghost Squad, all these classic light gun games that Sega has done over the years. So many great fighters, Last Bronx, Fighting Vipers. I think the world of possibilities with the Sega Ages collection on the Nintendo Switch is absolutely massive, and I want to see Sega explore it. I want to see Sega go deep into their vault, maybe even do some stuff that maybe you're not even thinking about, or even I'm thinking about. Forgotten Sega classics, because I think the Sega Ages collection could be really special and successful on the Nintendo Switch. With the lack of a standard virtual console, with things like the Hamster Neo Geo games doing so well, you know, those games always seem to sell really well on the Nintendo Switch eShop. I think this is a perfect market for Sega, and and I really hope they explore it. I really hope they go back into the vault and they put some time and effort into these games, because something like Daytona USA, Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, these would be awesome games to have on the go, and a lot of these games were regulated to either the arcade or the Sega Saturn, and they've never seen a re-release. So throw in some online play, give me some Daytona USA, give me something, Sega. I like what you're teasing here. I like how you're building up my anticipation. Just don't let me down. So now the question that remains is, what would you like to see in subsequent releases in the SEGA Ages collection? Do you think it's feasible to see games like Daytona USA or Virtua Fighter 2? Or do you think they'll stick with more older arcade games like Alien Syndrome and Gain Ground? Let me know in the comments section down below, and thank you for checking out this video. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. I love doing random Sega stuff and random retro gaming stuff on this channel, and as always, I will catch you guys on the next video. Later.